In June of 53 BC, according to the Greek historian Plutarch, 40,000 Roman soldiers watched their general hide his face in his cloak and refuse to speak. His son's severed head was mounted on a spear, paraded before the legions by enemies who had just done the impossible. The mathematics of this battle still defy military logic. Think about those numbers. 40,000 Romans, 7 full legions, Rome's finest heavy infantry, faced 10,000 Parthian cavalry in the open desert. According to every rule of ancient warfare, Rome should have won. Contemporary sources document what happened instead. 20,000 Romans dead, 10,000 captured, 7 sacred eagle standards lost. Plutarch records that the Parthian commander achieved this with casualties so minimal, the ancient sources don't even bother to count them. By the end of this video, you'll understand how documented tactical innovations and psychological warfare turned Roman military superiority into the Republic's worst Eastern disaster. A defeat that would reshape the ancient world. I'm about to reveal 3 documented facts that will change how you see ancient warfare. First, the logistics innovation that solved cavalry's oldest weakness. 1,000 camels carrying a weapon that made Roman shields useless. Second, why the Parthian commander who achieved this impossible victory was executed by his own king within months. Third, the theatrical performance where this Roman general's severed head became a stage prop in a Greek tragedy, while his killers watched and applauded. But here's what makes this historically fascinating. How did a force outnumbered 4-1 achieve one of the most lopsided victories in military history? What tactical decision, documented in multiple ancient sources, transformed a Roman general frightened out of his senses from hunter into prey? Why did the richest man in Rome, who could afford any intelligence network, trust an Arab guide who was feeding him lies? And how did a pure cavalry force, armed only with bows and lances, annihilate heavy infantry specifically designed to resist exactly this kind of attack? The answers lie in a perfect storm of ambition, deception, and a tactical revolution that Romans had never encountered. To understand how Rome's eastern ambitions died in the Mesopotamian desert, we need to meet the man whose greed and insecurity made it all inevitable. Marcus Licinius Crassus had spent 8 months hiding in a cave, not as punishment, but as survival. Born around 115 BC to a father who had achieved the censorship and celebrated a triumph, young Crassus should have inherited privilege. Instead, he inherited civil war. When the Marian faction seized Rome in 87 BC, they killed his father and brother. Plutarch records that Crassus fled to Spain, where he spent 8 months concealed in a vast coastal cave on the estate of a friend named Publius. The cave itself was a natural marvel. High roofs, internal recesses, a spring of pure water. To alleviate the young refugee's boredom, Publius even sent 2 female slaves to provide companionship, a gesture Crassus would remember decades later when power and wealth were his to command. When Cinna died and Sulla returned to Italy, Crassus emerged from hiding. He raised a small army in Spain and Africa, joined Sulla's forces, and won the decisive engagement at the Colline Gate when Sulla's own center faltered. That victory launched Crassus into Rome's brutal elite. What he did with the opportunity would define him. Ancient sources document a financial empire built on Rome's misery. Crassus leveraged Sulla's prescriptions, the systematic execution of political enemies, to buy confiscated estates at trifling prices. But his most innovative business model involved fire. He organized a private brigade of over 500 slaves trained as builders and architects. When fire broke out in Rome's crowded, high-rise apartment buildings, Crassus would arrive at the scene and offer to buy the burning property and the adjoining endangered structures. Property owners, facing total loss, sold for a pittance. At that point, Crassus's slaves would extinguish the flames and rebuild. Through this predatory scheme, he eventually owned a large portion of the city's real estate. Plutarch notes that Crassus personally oversaw the education of his slaves, believing that a master's most valuable tools were his human instruments. He accumulated thousands of specialized slaves, readers, scribes, silversmiths, stewards, architects. He owned silver mines worked by massive slave labor forces. He controlled agricultural land across the provinces. By 54 BC, his private inventory valued his property at over 7,100 talents, a fortune so vast that contemporary accounts struggled to comprehend it. Crassus himself defined wealth with brutal precision. He famously stated that no man should be considered rich who could not support an entire army out of his own private means. He could. He performed massive public acts of generosity, sacrificing a tenth of his goods to Hercules, providing every Roman citizen with enough grain to live for 3 months. Yet Plutarch observes that avarice was his only vice, so overwhelming it obscured all his other virtues. But wealth and ruthlessness couldn't buy what Crassus needed most. In 71 BC, he defeated the slave rebellion led by Spartacus. Appian records that the final battle killed 12,300 rebels. Crassus crucified 6,000 survivors along the Appian Way, their bodies lining the road from Rome to Capua as a monument to Roman power and Crassus's victory. Yet he received only an ovation, a lesser triumph, because his victory was over slaves rather than a sovereign nation. The distinction burned. Pompey was the celebrated conqueror of the East. Caesar was subduing Gaul, accumulating unprecedented wealth and a veteran army loyal to him personally. Crassus, despite being the richest man in Rome, found himself increasingly marginalized by partners who were becoming his masters. The insecurity would drive him to the desert. The ambition would kill him there. In 60 BC, 3 men divided Rome in secret. Within 5 years, the arrangement would collapse in blood. The First Triumvirate united rivals through mutual necessity. Julius Caesar sought the consulship and a command in Gaul. Pompey the Great required land grants for his veterans, rewards for conquering the eastern Mediterranean and defeating Mithridates, the sixth of Pontus. Crassus needed tax relief for his equestrian allies who had overbid for contracts in the eastern provinces. Ancient sources document how these 3 men, unable to achieve their goals through the Senate, formed an unofficial alliance to bypass traditional Roman political structures. For a time, the arrangement worked. Caesar got his consulship and departed for Gaul. Pompey secured his veteran settlements. Crassus obtained his financial reforms. But as the 50s progressed, the balance shifted dangerously. Pompey basked in glory as Rome's eastern conqueror, the general who had reorganized the Levant and humbled kings. Caesar was winning spectacular victories in Gaul, sending dispatches detailing conquests that brought unprecedented territory and wealth into Roman hands. His legions were becoming personally loyal to him, a private army disguised as a state force. And Crassus? He had defeated Spartacus. Contemporary accounts make clear how this graded. Plutarch records that Crassus felt his partners were becoming his masters. The man who could buy anything couldn't purchase the one commodity he craved: military glory to match Pompey's eastern triumph or Caesar's Gallic conquests. In 55 BC, during his second consulship with Pompey, Crassus secured the governorship of Syria for a 5-year term. His intent to invade Parthia was transparent. Ancient sources document immediate opposition. Cato the Younger argued that an unprovoked war against a nation with which Rome had a treaty was both illegal and impious. The tribune Attius Capito went further. He physically attempted to block Crassus's departure from Rome. When Crassus pressed forward, Atthius performed a ritual of ancient and terrifying curses at the city gates, dedicating Crassus to destruction. Plutarch records that Crassus ignored these warnings, just as he would ignore the consistently inauspicious omens reported by his seers. He departed for Syria with a single-minded determination. He would conquer the Parthian Empire. He would match or exceed Alexander the Great. He would return to Rome with a triumph that would eclipse both Pompey and Caesar. The ambition was magnificent. The execution would be catastrophic. But first, he needed an enemy. What he found in the East was an empire that fought by rules Rome didn't understand. While Rome built its power on heavy infantry, Parthia had perfected something Rome couldn't comprehend, an empire without foot soldiers. The Arsacid dynasty had absorbed the remnants of the Seleucid Empire and established a decentralized feudal system based on noble cavalry levies. Their military doctrine was revolutionary for the ancient world. A pure cavalry force with no infantry component. Two specialized units formed the core of Parthian military power. Horse archers provided long-range harassment, masters of the composite recurve bow and the famous Parthian shot, firing backward while retreating. Cataphracts delivered shock combat, both rider and horse encased in scale or mail armor from head to hoof, wielding the contus, a 12 to 14-foot lance capable of skewering multiple men in a single charge. This system had proven itself against the Seleucids and made Parthia the only major power in the Near East capable of checking Roman expansion. By 53 BC, King Orodes II had just emerged victorious from a brutal civil war against his brother Mithridates IV, whom he had executed after a siege at Seleucia on the Tigris. His throne was secure, but the new Roman threat demanded immediate response. Orodes divided his forces with strategic sophistication. He personally led the majority of his army, infantry and foot archers, to invade Armenia and punish King Artavasdes II for his alliance with Rome. To harass and delay Crassus in Mesopotamia, he sent a much smaller force of approximately 10,000 cavalry under the command of a young nobleman from the Surin clan. Plutarch provides remarkably specific details about this commander, the kind of precision that suggests eyewitness testimony reached him across the decades. The man's personal name has been lost to history. We know him only by his title, Surena, head of the House of Surin. He was very young, in his mid to late 20s, an age that would shock the Romans when they discovered who had destroyed them. But youth hadn't prevented brilliance. Surena had placed Orodes on the throne by defeating Mithridates in civil war, personally capturing Seleucia on the Tigris. The Surin clan held hereditary privilege, the right to crown Parthian kings, and massive wealth. Ancient sources document the scale of Surena's personal retinue. His military household numbered 10,000 cavalry, separate from the forces he would command at Carrhae. His support train included 200 wagons for personal belongings and 1,000 camels carrying concubines. 1,000 heavily armed cavalry served as his personal bodyguard. This wasn't just a military commander. This was a mobile royal court. Plutarch notes that Surena painted his face with cosmetics, according to Parthian noble custom, wore his hair parted in Median fashion, and possessed striking beauty. Details that emphasize how different this enemy was from anything Rome had faced. Orodes sent Surena to delay the Romans, not defeat them. The king expected the young general to pin down Crassus while the Armenian front was secured. He had no idea what his young commander was capable of. Crassus crossed into Syria with 7 legions. According to Plutarch, they numbered just under 40,000 men. On paper, it was overwhelming force. In practice, it was the wrong army for the war ahead. Contemporary sources provide exact composition. 7 legions of heavy infantry numbered approximately 35,000 to 38,000 legionaries, each man carrying 60 to 80 pounds of equipment. 4,000 light infantry, archers, slingers, and skirmishers provided minimal missile support. Not quite 4,000 cavalry, mostly Gallic auxiliaries, completed the force. Among the cavalry rode 1,300 elite horsemen under the command of Crassus's son, Publius, veterans from Caesar's Gallic campaigns, the finest mounted warriors Rome could field. The Roman legionary was optimized for close-quarter combat. His gladius, a short sword 18 to 24 inches long, was designed for thrusting in tight formation. His pilum, a heavy javelin 6 to 7 feet in length, was engineered to penetrate shields and bend on impact, preventing enemies from throwing it back. His scutum, a large curved rectangular shield 4 feet by 2.5 feet, constructed of wood reinforced with iron, could interlock with his comrades' shields to form an impenetrable wall. His armor, mail or scale, protected against sword cuts and spear thrusts. Archaeological evidence and ancient descriptions confirm these men were the finest heavy infantry ever assembled. But historians analyzing force composition reveal a critical mismatch. Roman missile troops numbered only 4,000, less than 10% of the army. Parthian missile troops, horse archers, numbered approximately 9,000, 90% of their force. Roman auxiliary bows offered shorter range and less penetration power than Parthian composite recurve weapons. The technological gap was severe. The tactical doctrine mismatch was worse. Roman strength lay in close combat, heavy infantry shock, disciplined formations designed to close with the enemy and destroy him with sword and shield. Roman weakness was speed. Those 60 to 80 pounds of equipment per man created a slow, ponderous force, and limited cavalry and minimal long-range striking power. The legions needed the enemy to close to arm's length. They were built to dominate the final phase of ancient battle, the grinding melee where discipline and armor and training meant everything. Parthian strength lay in mobility, missile superiority, and the tactical flexibility to refuse close combat entirely. They could choose engagement distance, circle enemy formations indefinitely, and rain arrows from ranges where Roman infantry couldn't respond. The paradox was brutal. Romans needed the enemy to fight Roman-style warfare. Parthians would never comply. Every piece of Roman equipment was designed to kill men at arm's length. The Parthians would never get that close. In the spring of 53 BC, Crassus made a choice. Armenian king Artavasdes arrived in person with an offer that would have saved 20,000 Roman lives. Crassus refused. Plutarch documents the Armenian proposal in detail. Artavasdes urged Crassus to invade Parthia through the northern route via Armenian mountains. The offer included substantial reinforcements, 10,000 armored cavalry and 30,000 infantry. The mountainous terrain would neutralize Parthian cavalry mobility, forcing them to fight on ground favorable to Roman heavy infantry. The combined Roman-Armenian force would number over 80,000 men with balanced capabilities. Historians debate why Crassus rejected this strategic advantage. Possible explanations include distrust of Artavasdes, greed for quicker access to the wealthy Mesopotamian cities along the Tigris, underestimation of the Parthian cavalry threat, or simple pride, unwillingness to appear dependent on Armenian assistance. Ancient sources don't preserve Crassus's reasoning. They document only his decision. He chose the faster plains route through Mesopotamia. The Romans crossed the Euphrates at Zeugma, a major Roman bridging point. Plutarch records that omens multiplied at the crossing. A thunderstorm scattered bridging equipment as engineers worked. Lightning struck the sacrifice area where priests were reading entrails. The primary eagle standard turned of its own accord, an event that sent shock waves through the legionaries. Soldiers murmured about inauspicious signs. Crassus pressed forward, dismissing divine warnings with the same contempt he'd shown the tribune's curse. Shortly after crossing, the Roman army encountered an Arab chieftain named Ariamnes, also called Abgarus in some sources. This man had previously served Pompey, a fact that established Roman trust. Contemporary accounts document what happened next with grim clarity. Ariamnes was a double agent in Surena's employ. The Arab guide fed Crassus carefully crafted lies. He claimed the Parthian army was in chaos, fleeing eastward to save their treasures. He insisted the Parthians were avoiding battle, that rapid pursuit could catch them in disarray. Most critically, he urged Crassus to leave the Euphrates River and strike directly across the Mesopotamian desert, cutting off the Parthian retreat. Plutarch makes clear this appealed to Crassus's desire for quick, glorious victory. The general abandoned the river route, his water supply, his retreat path, his logistical lifeline, and led 40,000 legionaries inland into open desert. Every step took the Romans deeper into terrain perfectly suited for cavalry and catastrophically wrong for heavy infantry. The march conditions deteriorated. Heat became oppressive. Water grew scarce. Roman scouts began disappearing. Picked off by Parthian cavalry the army never saw. By the time Crassus realized his guide was lying, the Romans were 30 miles from the river. The Parthians were waiting. The plains near Carrhae, as Plutarch describes and modern geographical analysis confirms, stretched flat as a killing floor. No hills, no forests, no obstacles. Just open ground where cavalry could circle endlessly and heavy infantry had nowhere to hide. The battlefield lay between the Balikh River and the Euphrates in the Mesopotamian desert. Historians examining the terrain identify characteristics that would prove devastating to Roman hopes. Flat, open expanses offered perfect visibility for cavalry reconnaissance and unlimited space for mounted maneuver. Minimal water sources meant the Romans, having abandoned the river, would fight thirsty under the brutal early June sun. Contemporary accounts repeatedly emphasize the heat and its impact on armored men. When Roman scouts returned reporting a massive cavalry force approaching, Plutarch records that Crassus was frightened out of his senses. The general who had faced down Spartacus's rebellion panicked at the first solid intelligence about his enemy. His initial order demonstrated confusion, formed the army in a long line to prevent encirclement. He immediately recognized the problem. A line would be too thin to resist determined assault. He retracted the order and commanded the army to form a massive hollow square instead. The formation placed 12 cohorts per side, approximately 3,000 to 4,000 men per face. Crassus commanded one face. His son Publius commanded the second. The quaestor Cassius commanded the third. A fourth officer, whose name history hasn't preserved, commanded the final face. Cavalry was divided equally among the four corners. The square was designed to present no weak flank, to resist attack from any direction. It was sound defensive doctrine. It was also an admission that Crassus had surrendered offensive initiative before a single arrow flew. The Parthians approached with their strength concealed. Ancient sources document the psychological theater Surena staged for maximum impact. The cavalry kept their numbers hidden, their armor covered with skins and leather garments. They appeared less numerous and less formidable than reality. Then, on Surina's signal, they dropped the coverings. Plutarch provides vivid sensory detail. Arms gleaming in the sun, Mardian steel and Parthian armor flashing, creating a visual spectacle that stunned the Romans. Simultaneously, war drums and bells created what Plutarch describes as a deep and terrifying roar. The acoustic assault combined with the visual revelation to deliver maximum psychological shock. The Romans realized they faced 10,000 armored cavalry, a full mobile army, not a harassment force. Surina's initial plan, according to Plutarch, was a cataphract charge to break the Roman line. But the hollow square presented no weak point for shock cavalry to exploit. Every face was equally strong, every flank protected. The young general made a decision that would define the battle. He would win through pure missile warfare instead. The horse archers spread out, beginning to circle the Roman formation. Plutarch notes they moved not in regular order, but in scattered groups, creating uncertainty about where the main attack would come. The encirclement had begun. What happened in the next several hours would be documented by sources on both sides as a revolution in ancient warfare. At Surina's command, 9,000 horse archers bent their composite bows. What followed wasn't a battle. It was physics. The Parthian composite recurved bow represented the cutting edge of ancient missile technology. Plutarch's descriptions, supported by archaeological evidence and modern experimental archaeology, reveal weapons of devastating power. The Yueji Saka design employed by Parthian archers was longer and more powerful than the Scythian-style bows used by Roman auxiliaries. Layers of horn, wood, and sinew laminated together created a weapon that required months to construct and careful maintenance, but delivered kinetic energy that ancient sources struggled to comprehend. Plutarch provides specific, gruesome details about arrow penetration. The heavy, barbed Parthian arrows pierced Roman shields. They penetrated heavy mail armor at distance. The historian records that the arrows riveted soldiers' hands to their shields, that they nailed feet through boots to the ground. These weren't literary exaggerations. Archaeological studies of Parthian arrowheads confirm their size, weight, and armor-defeating design. When these arrows struck flesh, they couldn't be easily removed. The barbed heads tore tissue as badly coming out as going in. The encirclement allowed the Parthians to attack from all directions simultaneously. Plutarch notes the formation was deliberate. Scattered groups prevented Romans from focusing fire or coordinating charges. The arrow storm began in earnest, thousands of shafts per minute filling the air. A mechanical hailstorm of steel and wood and feathers. Romans endured the barrage with disciplined stoicism at first. They had survived worse. Arrow storms always ended when the enemy's ammunition was exhausted. Veterans knew this. They waited for the inevitable lull when they could counterattack. Then they saw the camels. Plutarch specifically documents the innovation that made victory possible. Surina had brought 1,000 camels loaded with hundreds of thousands of spare arrows. The Parthian archers didn't carry all their ammunition on their horses. They carried standard quivers, but when those emptied, they could rotate back to the camel train, refill their supplies, and return to the battle line. The resupply system allowed continuous, sustained barrage throughout the entire day. Contemporary accounts make clear the psychological impact. Romans saw the camel train and realized the arrow storm would never end. Hope turned to despair. The tactical situation became impossible. The legionaries attempted the testudo, the famous tortoise formation where shields interlocked overhead to create mobile cover. Plutarch documents why this standard defensive measure failed. First, the Parthians shifted to high-angle fire. arrows raining from above rather than flying horizontally. The testudo protected against level shots, but created a target for plunging fire. Second, the bunched formation made the force vulnerable to cataphract charges. When Roman infantry compressed under their shields, Parthian heavy cavalry could approach and attack the immobilized formation with lances. Third, the heat and crowding increased suffering. Men packed together in the June sun, wearing armor, carrying shields, breathing each other's exhalations. The testudo became a torture device. The Romans faced a tactical paradox with no solution. Stand still in formation, become target practice for archers. Form testudo, become vulnerable to cataphracts and high-angle fire. Charge the enemy, get outmaneuvered by faster cavalry. Every response led to casualties with no possibility of inflicting damage in return. For 2 hours, the Romans endured what should have been impossible. Then Crassus made a decision that would kill his son. Crassus recognized the mathematics. Passive defense meant death by 1,000 arrows. He ordered his son to do the impossible: break through 10,000 cavalry with 6,000 men. Plutarch records that Crassus saw his army would be whittled away to nothing if they remained stationary. The general ordered Publius to lead a breakout, to disrupt the Parthian archers and create an opening for the main army. The younger Crassus assembled a force designed for rapid shock action. 1,300 Gallic cavalry formed the core, elite horsemen who had fought under Julius Caesar in Gaul, men who knew mounted warfare intimately. 500 archers provided missile support. 8 cohorts of infantry, approximately 4,000 men, gave the force staying power. The total numbered roughly 6,000, enough for a powerful thrust. Publius charged the Parthian horse archers with the confidence of a man who had won battles before. The Parthians responded with their signature tactic, the maneuver that had broken enemy armies from the steppes to Syria. They practiced a feigned retreat, withdrawing before the Roman charge. Ancient sources document how perfectly the trap worked. The Parthians fell back, drawing Publius away from the main army with what appeared to be panic. The young commander pursued with great eagerness and confidence, believing his charge had broken the enemy line. The distance grew. Visual contact with his father's forces was lost. Publius found himself isolated in the Mesopotamian desert with 6,000 men and a developing sense that he'd made a terrible mistake. Once the separation was complete, the Parthians turned. Cataphracts charged from the front, heavy lances leveled, armored horses thundering across the sand. Horse archers circled and enveloped from all sides, completing the surrounding movement. Publius was trapped, cut off from retreat, facing the entire Parthian cavalry force. The terrain compounded his problems. Plutarch notes the area was full of deep sand that slowed infantry and made formation difficult to maintain. There was no elevation to anchor defense, no obstacles to protect flanks. Perfect ground for cavalry, nightmare ground for surrounded infantry. The Gallic cavalry fought with what Plutarch calls suicidal bravery. These veterans of Caesar's campaigns understood they were dying, but refused to die easily. Contemporary accounts preserve specific tactical details that reveal the desperation of close combat against cataphracts. The Gauls seized the lances of Parthian heavy cavalry and pulled riders to the ground through sheer strength and determination. Some dismounted deliberately to stab the unarmored bellies of Parthian horses, the only vulnerable point on the armored beasts. Plutarch records that some horses impaled themselves on swords, the momentum of their charge driving blades deep into their bodies. But courage couldn't overcome the environmental and numerical reality. The blazing sun and extreme heat exhausted men in heavy armor. Thirst became torture. There was no water, and the desert conditions drained bodies faster than combat. Sand kicked up by thousands of hooves blinded and choked the Romans. The continuous arrow bombardment from all directions meant casualties mounted in heaps, as Plutarch phrases it. Publius organized a final stand on a small hill, the only defensible position available. He ordered the horses placed in the center, with men forming a perimeter around them. The continuous arrow fire from surrounding Parthians made the position untenable. Men fell steadily. The circle contracted. Wounded, unable to use his sword arm, Publius saw the situation with brutal clarity. There would be no rescue. There would be no escape. Capture would mean torture and humiliation. He made the choice Roman military culture trained commanders to make. He ordered his shield-bearer to kill him. The shield-bearer complied, then killed himself. Ancient sources record that from approximately 6,000 men in Publius's force, only 500 were taken prisoner. 5,500 Romans died in the sandy killing ground. The Parthians severed Publius's head and mounted it on a spear as a trophy. Then they rode back to show his father what they'd done. The Parthians rode close to the Roman square. On a spear, clearly visible, was Publius Crassus's severed head. They called for his father to come view his son. Plutarch documents the mockery with specific detail. The Parthian cavalry approached the main Roman formation, the head of the young commander displayed prominently. They shouted for Crassus to come forward to witness his son's fate. They called out that Publius had displayed courage worthy of his father, words designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. The taunt worked. Contemporary accounts preserve Crassus's response with clinical precision. He hid himself in his cloak and refused to speak. The richest man in Rome, the general who commanded 40,000 soldiers, the politician who had dominated Senate debates. He pulled fabric over his face like a child hiding from nightmares and abdicated command. Grief overwhelmed function. The psychological breaking point had been reached and passed. Officers Octavius and Cassius were forced to assume control. The command structure held because subordinates stepped into the vacuum, but the troops witnessed their general's complete breakdown. Soldiers saw Crassus's inability to lead. They saw their commander's son's head on enemy display. They understood, with the clarity that comes from imminent death, that there was no hope of victory. The psychological shift was complete. They were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to survive until nightfall. The Parthians resumed their encirclement and archery with renewed intensity. The Romans had no answer, no offensive capability, no hope of disrupting the enemy system. The arrow storm continued. Men died steadily. The heat intensified as afternoon progressed. Thirst became torture. Water had run out hours before, and the desert sun was unforgiving. Plutarch describes an additional environmental weapon the Parthians employed. The cavalry's movement kicked up massive clouds of sand and dust. The Romans could not see arrows until they were upon them. Visibility dropped. Fear increased. Death invisible until the final instant. The dust also prevented coordination between different sections of the square. Officers couldn't see across the formation. Commands couldn't be reliably transmitted. The army was blind, thirsty, leaderless, and dying. For hours this continued. No lull, no respite. The camel train ensured the Parthians could maintain pressure indefinitely. The tactical impossibility remained absolute. Every Roman option led to casualties. No Roman action could inflict casualties on the enemy. As the sun approached the horizon, the Parthians finally withdrew. They announced they would give one night to mourn his son. The threat was implicit and understood by every Roman who heard it. At dawn, the Parthians would return to finish what they'd started. The Romans stood in their square, shields locked, bleeding from 1,000 wounds. The only question now was whether they'd live to see another sunrise. As the sun set, Parthian cavalry rode back to their camp. Contemporary sources document the state of the Roman army at nightfall with grim precision. Approximately 4,000 lay dead on the field. Thousands more were wounded, many mortally. Morale was shattered. Water was gone. Food was limited. Leadership was compromised. Crassus remained non-functional, wrapped in grief and shame. Octavius and Cassius conferred and made the decision that battlefield necessity demanded. Remaining in position meant annihilation when the Parthians returned at dawn. The army had to retreat to the city of Carrhae, approximately 5 to 7 miles distant, before morning light revealed their movement. The march had to be silent to avoid detection. Plutarch records the decision that ancient sources would condemn as particularly cruel, to maintain silence and speed. And the Romans would abandon approximately 4,000 wounded in the camp. The rationale was brutally logical. Wounded men would slow the march with their groans and their need for assistance. They would create noise that might alert Parthian scouts. Carrying them was impossible given the army's depleted condition. The wounded understood what was happening. Contemporary accounts preserve the horror. As the able-bodied soldiers quietly gathered equipment and formed up for the night march, the wounded realized they were being left behind. Their cries and pleas would haunt survivors. Some tried to follow despite their injuries. Others simply waited for dawn and the death they knew was coming. The night march fragmented the army. One local guide named Ignatios knew the paths and led the majority under Octavius and Cassius. Crassus's column became separated in the darkness, following a different guide. By morning, the Roman army had split into 4 distinct groups. Cassius reached the Syrian border with approximately 500 cavalry, the fastest and most mobile element. Octavius led roughly 5,000 men to a defensible hill where terrain offered some protection. A tribune named Vargunteus made it to Carrhae with approximately 4 cohorts, and Crassus, misled by his guide Andromachus, whether through treachery or incompetence, sources differ, became lost in marshes and difficult terrain with only a few cohorts. When the Parthians returned to the abandoned Roman camp at dawn, they found 4,000 wounded men. Ancient sources record what happened with clinical brevity. The Parthians slaughtered all 4,000. Some wounded were taken prisoner, their fates unrecorded, but the vast majority were killed where they lay. By dawn, Cassius was riding toward Syria. Octavius held a defensible hill with 5,000 men. Vargunteus was safe behind Carrhae's walls, and Crassus was trapped in the marshes with a traitor or fool for a guide and the Parthian army hunting him. At dawn, Parthian scouts found the abandoned camp and began hunting survivors. When they located Crassus trapped in the marshes, one Roman officer made a choice that defines loyalty. Octavius had reached his defensible hill with 5,000 men and recognized his tactical situation with professional clarity. The position was strong enough to resist assault. The path to Syria was open. He could retreat, preserve his force, and escape. Plutarch records that Octavius refused. He would not abandon his commander. Against all military logic, against the survival instinct that should dominate in defeat, Octavius marched toward Crassus's position to attempt a rescue. Crassus's situation was desperate. His guide Andromachus had led the small force into marshes and difficult terrain, whether deliberately or through incompetence. The Parthians had surrounded the position on a small hill. There was no escape route, and the men were exhausted and demoralized. Surena, having achieved victory beyond anything Orodes had anticipated, now wanted to complete the triumph by capturing the Roman general alive. Ancient sources document the false parley that followed. Surena sent messengers offering truce and safe conduct. The message claimed that King Orodes desired peace and would allow the Romans to return home if a treaty was signed. The requirement was specific. The treaty must be signed in writing by the river Euphrates. Plutarch preserves what may be Surena's actual words. "You Romans are not very mindful of agreements." Roman officers immediately distrusted the offer. They urged Crassus not to meet with Surena, to wait for Octavius's relief force or attempt a breakout under darkness. But the common soldiers, desperate and blaming Crassus for the disaster, threatened mutiny. They wanted any chance of survival. They pressured their general to accept the parley. Crassus initially refused, but the pressure from his own troops forced compliance. He agreed to meet Surena between the lines. The Parthian commander rode out with a horse bearing golden trappings, offering to transport Crassus to the Euphrates for the treaty signing. What happened next remains disputed in ancient sources. The Parthians tried to place or lift Crassus onto the horse. Roman officers, including Octavius, grew suspicious and grabbed the horse's reins. The Parthians tried to push or pull Crassus onto the mount. A scuffle erupted into open melee. Octavius was killed in the fighting. Crassus was killed in the chaos. Plutarch names a Parthian officer called Pomaxathres as the killer. But Cassius Dio suggests some sources claimed Crassus was killed by his own men to prevent his capture. The exact circumstances remain unclear. What is certain is that Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, died in a Mesopotamian marsh surrounded by enemies and abandoned by fortune. The Parthians severed his head and cut off his right hand. Both were sent to King Orodes in Armenia as victory trophies. The remaining Romans on the hill were slaughtered or captured. Few escaped. The richest man in Rome, who could buy anything except respect, died without a denarius to his name. His head was on its way to a theater. In the Armenian royal palace, King Orodes was celebrating. He'd forced Armenia into a peace treaty, sealed with a marriage alliance. To mark the occasion, the court was watching a Greek tragedy about a mother who brings her son's severed head onto the stage. The timing was perfect. Plutarch provides such specific detail about this event that historians consider it likely authentic despite its almost too perfect symbolism. Orodes had invaded Armenia while Surena fought at Carrhae. He'd forced Artavasdes into a peace treaty confirmed by a royal marriage. During the banquet celebrating the alliance, the court was entertained with a performance of Euripides' tragedy, the Bacchae. The play tells the story of Agave who, driven mad by the god Dionysus, kills her own son Pentheus and brings his severed head onto the stage, believing it to be a lion's head. The actor Jason of Tralles was playing Agave, approaching the scene where the character enters with her son's head. Props were prepared for the theatrical moment. Just as Jason prepared to take up the prop head, Crassus's actual head arrived at the banquet hall. Contemporary accounts record that it was tossed into the performance space. The actor, demonstrating either remarkable improvisation or calculated propaganda, seized Crassus's head instead of the theatrical prop and sang Euripides' lines. "We bring from the mountain a recently cut tendril to the palace, a blessed prey." The symbolic perfection seems almost too convenient. A play about a mother bringing her son's severed head merges with reality as victorious enemies bring a Roman general's head. A Greek tragedy witnesses Roman military catastrophe. The cultural layers: Greek drama, Roman victim, Parthian and Armenian audience, create meaning that Plutarch clearly recognized when he chose to document this event with such specificity. The parallel was perfect. Agave had killed her son in madness. Crassus, through ambition and poor judgment, had sent his son Publius to death. The play, written 400 years earlier by Euripides, found its perfect real-world mirror in Mesopotamian sand and Armenian palace. Euripides had written his tragedy centuries before. It took Marcus Crassus to give it the perfect ending. When Roman historians tallied the dead, the numbers defied comprehension. In less than 48 hours, 7 Roman legions had been reduced to scattered survivors and a column of prisoners marching toward the edge of the known world. Plutarch and Cassius Dio provide casualty figures that multiple sources confirm. Approximately 20,000 Romans were killed. Another 10,000 were captured. Only 10,000 escaped to Syria, most with Cassius's rapid cavalry withdrawal. The 7 legionary eagle standards, sacred symbols of Roman military might, were captured, a religious and moral disgrace that would haunt Rome for a generation. These numbers require context to understand their historical magnitude. The casualty rate was 50% killed, 75% killed or captured. In contemporary terms, this ranked among Rome's worst defeats. Carrhae in 216 BC had been worse. Approximately 50,000 Romans killed by Hannibal. Arausio in 105 BC was worse. Roughly 80,000 killed by Germanic tribes. Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD would be comparable. 15 to 20,000 killed with 100% of the force destroyed. But Carrhae was Rome's worst defeat east of Italy. It shattered the myth of legionary invincibility in the Eastern theater. Modern military historians analyzing the battle note that this was among the most lopsided victories in ancient warfare, achieved not through numerical superiority, but through tactical and technological innovation. The 10,000 Roman prisoners were marched to Alexandria Margiana, modern Merv in Turkmenistan, on the northeastern frontier of the Parthian Empire. The distance was over 1,500 miles from the battlefield. These men were settled as border guards against nomadic invasions. Contemporary sources provide no information about treatment or survival rates. The prisoners simply disappeared from the historical record, their fates unknown. Their families in Italy left to wonder what became of husbands, fathers, and sons who marched east and never returned. As for Parthian casualties, ancient sources provide no figures whatsoever. The silence itself suggests the answer. Casualties were minimal enough that chroniclers didn't consider them worth recording. The battle had been fought at range. The Parthians had avoided close combat, except when Publius's force was isolated and overwhelmed. Modern estimates suggest hundreds at most, possibly low thousands if Publius's Gallic cavalry inflicted significant damage during their desperate last stand. Regardless, the disparity was enormous. 7 sacred eagles lost, 20,000 Romans dead, 10,000 marching into permanent exile. The mathematics of ancient warfare had been rewritten in blood. But the numbers told only one story. The political consequences would tell another. The First Triumvirate died in the Mesopotamian desert, along with 20,000 Romans. One man escaped Carrhae with his military reputation intact. Gaius Cassius Longinus, Crassus's quaestor, would prove that defeat teaches more than victory ever could. Cassius had commanded one face of the hollow square during the battle. Plutarch records that after Crassus's breakdown, Cassius and Octavius jointly assumed command and organized the night retreat. While Octavius attempted the hopeless rescue that cost his life, Cassius led approximately 500 cavalry in a rapid withdrawal to the Syrian border. Speed and decisiveness saved his force when loyalty killed Octavius. The Parthians expected Syria to fall easily. The province was vulnerable, defended by scattered garrisons and demoralized by news of the disaster. Parthian cavalry raided across the border, testing defenses and probing for weakness. What they found instead was competence forged in catastrophe. Cassius reorganized Syrian defenses with limited resources and hard-won knowledge. He increased auxiliary cavalry, understanding now that mobility mattered in the east. He avoided open terrain where Parthian cavalry could dominate. He fortified cities and focused on defensive positions where Roman heavy infantry could fight on favorable terms. Contemporary sources document that he successfully defended the province during 52 and 51 BC, preventing Parthian conquest and stabilizing the frontier. The defense succeeded partly because of Cassius's tactical adaptations and partly because of Parthian internal politics. Plutarch records that Orodes executed Serena shortly after Carrhae. The young general's popularity and power threatened the king. Despite, or because of, his greatest triumph, Serena was killed on his own king's orders. The Parthian Empire lost its most brilliant commander, just when that brilliance could have been exploited to conquer Roman Syria. Without Serena's tactical genius, Parthian raids became manageable rather than existential. Cassius held Syria through competence and the inadvertent assistance of paranoid Parthian monarchy. He returned to Rome, became praetor, and entered the political machinery that would lead him to his most famous act. In 44 BC, Gaius Cassius Longinus became the primary conspirator in Julius Caesar's assassination. He led the plot that ended the dictatorship and, inadvertently, ended the republic. At Philippi in 42 BC, defeated by Mark Antony and Octavian, Cassius committed suicide. But he'd already secured his historical legacy twice over, as the Roman who saved Syria after Carrhae and as the man who killed Caesar. Carrhae had taught him that mobility defeats heavy infantry, that cavalry dominates open ground, and that even Rome's greatest generals can fail catastrophically. 11 years later, he applied those lessons to killing the Republic's dictator. The First Triumvirate died twice. First in 54 BC, when Caesar's daughter Julia, Pompey's wife, died in childbirth. Then in 53 BC, when Crassus died in the desert. Without the buffer, Caesar and Pompey had nothing between them but ambition. The original triumvirate structure had been inherently unstable. Three ambitious men sharing power through mutual necessity rather than trust. Each required the others to overcome Senate opposition, but each also competed for popular support and military glory. Crassus's role as mediator and financial backer had been essential to maintaining the fragile balance. Julia's death in 54 BC removed the personal bond between Caesar and Pompey. The marriage had been political, but it created family connection that imposed restraint. Plutarch documents in his Life of Pompey and Life of Caesar that the relationship deteriorated markedly after her death. The affection Pompey felt for his young wife had genuinely moderated his political calculations. Without her, the two generals faced each other as rivals rather than family. 1 year later, Crassus died at Carrhae. The buffer was gone. Modern historians analyzing the subsequent events note the remarkable speed of political deterioration. In 53 BC, Crassus dies and the triumvirate becomes a doomvirate. In 52 BC, political violence in Rome becomes uncontrollable, and Pompey is made sole consul, effectively giving him dictatorial powers. In 50 and 49 BC, the Senate, backed by Pompey, demands Caesar surrender his command in Gaul and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar understood perfectly what that meant. Without his army and his legal immunity as proconsul, he would face prosecution from political enemies. He would likely be exiled or killed. The choice was surrender and die, or fight and possibly die, but possibly win. In 49 BC, Caesar crossed the Rubicon and marched on Rome. The civil war that ancient sources document with such detail began because two men who had once shared power could no longer coexist without the third who had balanced them. Most historians agree that Carrhae directly contributed to the civil war's timing and inevitability. With Crassus alive, the Triumvirate might have lasted longer. The mediation and financial resources he provided had genuine value in managing the complex three-way relationship. Without him, confrontation became structurally inevitable. The long-term consequences rippled outward. The civil war would kill Pompey in 48 BC. It would make Caesar dictator and lead to his assassination in 44 BC. It would trigger another round of civil wars that would end with Octavian becoming Augustus, the first emperor, and the Republic transitioning to empire. A desert battlefield 2,000 miles from Rome determined who would rule the Republic. Caesar would cross the Rubicon. Pompey would die in Egypt. The Senate would fall. And it all traced back to the moment Crassus rejected the Armenian route and led 40,000 men into the Mesopotamian desert. The Euphrates River became more than a boundary. It became a monument to Roman limits, a line carved not in stone, but in the memory of 20,000 dead. Before Carrhae, Roman expansion eastward had seemed as inevitable as Roman expansion westward. Pompey had reorganized the eastern Mediterranean. Caesar was conquering Gaul. The assumption among Rome's political class was that the empire would continue growing until geography or ocean imposed limits. The Parthian Empire appeared to be just another obstacle to overcome. After Carrhae, the Euphrates became a de facto boundary that would last for centuries. The river marked where Roman power met its match. Contemporary strategic analysis by modern historians notes that Rome could raid across the Euphrates, but could not hold Parthian territory. The fundamental military mismatch. Roman heavy infantry optimal for different terrain than Parthian cavalry meant conquest was prohibitively expensive, even when temporarily achievable. The 7 captured eagle standards became a national obsession. These sacred symbols of legionary honor and Roman divine favor had to be recovered. The shame of their loss permeated military and political culture. Julius Caesar was planning a massive revenge campaign against Parthia when he was assassinated in 44 BC. His grand strategic vision included settling the Eastern question through overwhelming force. Mark Antony attempted the revenge campaign in 36 BC. He invaded Parthia with a huge army. Contemporary sources document another disaster. Antony's forces suffered heavy losses, and he was forced to retreat. The campaign failed to recover the eagles or restore Roman prestige. The Parthian cavalry tactics that had destroyed Crassus worked again. It took diplomatic rather than military success to recover the standards. In 20 BC, Augustus Caesar used a combination of threats and negotiations to pressure King Phraates IV into returning the captured eagles. Augustus celebrated this diplomatic achievement as though it were a military victory. The Augustus of Prima Porta statue, one of the most famous pieces of Roman art, depicts the returned standards on the emperor's breastplate. The recovery had taken 33 years and required Rome to acknowledge it couldn't simply take them back by force. Later emperors made attempts to expand eastward. Trajan briefly conquered Mesopotamia between 114 and 117 AD, but Rome couldn't hold the territory. The logistics of maintaining forces so far from Italy combined with Parthian and later Sasanian military capabilities, made permanent conquest impossible. The contrast with Alexander the Great was stark. Alexander had conquered the Persian Empire and reached India. His Hellenistic successor states had ruled the East for centuries. Rome, despite being militarily more powerful than Alexander's Macedonian army, could never replicate his eastern conquests. The fundamental difference was the evolution of cavalry tactics. The Parthians and Sasanians had developed combined arms cavalry warfare that heavy infantry couldn't overcome on open terrain. Somewhere in the Mesopotamian desert, exact battlefield lost to time, 20,000 Romans created a boundary that would outlast the empire they served. The Euphrates still flows. The plains near Carrhae still stretch flat and endless. And the line between what Rome could take and what it had to accept ran through that river for half a millennium. Military historians analyze Carrhae as a case study in what happens when doctrine meets reality and reality wins. The lessons carved in Mesopotamian sand remain relevant across millennia. Roman military reforms after Carrhae are documented in later force compositions and tactical manuals. Eastern armies received increased auxiliary cavalry, addressing the mobility deficit that had proven fatal. Archer integration improved, with more missile troops incorporated into standard legion structures. Terrain awareness became central to operational planning. Commanders learned to respect open ground where cavalry could dominate. Intelligence gathering improved, with better vetting of local guides and scouts. The disaster taught Rome that different theaters required different tactical approaches. The Parthian victory vindicated their combined arms cavalry system. Ancient sources document how two specialized cavalry types, horse archers for harassment and cataphracts for shock, created a complete military system that could defeat heavy infantry without closing to the melee where Roman advantages would matter. Modern military analysts studying ancient warfare note the sophistication of this approach. Each cavalry type covered the other's weaknesses. Horse archers prevented enemy infantry from forming for counterattack. Cataphracts prevented enemy infantry from pursuing scattered horse archers. The combination was greater than the sum of its parts. The camel train innovation solved cavalry's traditional limitation. Horse archers throughout ancient history faced ammunition constraints. Once quivers emptied, they had to withdraw or risk close combat. Serena's logistics system allowed sustained operations, turning a temporary advantage into a day-long dominance. The principle endures in modern warfare. Logistics determines tactical possibilities. An army can only fight as long as its supplies last. But the deepest lesson was about doctrine itself. Roman assumption that heavy infantry superiority was universal proved catastrophic when faced with an enemy who refused to fight by Roman rules. The Parthians demonstrated that battlefield success depends on matching tactics to terrain and forcing the caustic enemy to fight where they're weakest. Contemporary military theorists analyzing Carrhae note that technology and numbers don't guarantee victory. Superior tactical adaptation to specific circumstances matters more than abstract superiority in ideal conditions. The cultural memory of Carrhae shaped Roman literature and political discourse for generations. Plutarch's detailed account served as a cautionary tale about greed and hubris. The moral lesson was clear. Ambition divorced from reality invites disaster. Political warnings referenced Crassus when discussing reckless military ventures. Military warnings invoked Carrhae when discussing the dangers of underestimating enemy capabilities or overestimating one's own advantages. Historians ranking Roman military disasters consistently place Carrhae alongside Cannae and Teutoburg Forest as defining defeats that changed strategic thinking. Each revealed fundamental vulnerabilities. Carrhae showed that tactical genius could defeat superior numbers. Teutoburg showed that terrain could negate training and equipment. Carrhae showed that the enemy's choice of how to fight mattered more than theoretical force superiority. Every tactical lesson cost lives. Every logistical innovation was written in Roman blood. Every military reform bore the names of 20,000 men who learned the hard way that even Rome had limits. June 53, B.C. 40,000 Romans faced 10,000 Parthians. Every military manual said Rome would win. Instead, 20,000 lay dead, 10,000 marched toward the edge of the world, and 7 sacred eagles became trophies in a foreign king's palace. The mathematics of ancient warfare had been rewritten in blood. Carrhae wasn't just a military defeat, it was a revelation. The wealthiest man in the world discovered that money couldn't buy military genius. The most disciplined infantry ever assembled learned that discipline meant nothing against an enemy who refused to fight on their terms. Rome's unstoppable expansion machine found its limits carved in desert sand and marked by a river it would never permanently cross. But here's the deeper truth that ancient sources preserve. This battle mattered because it proved that human systems have boundaries. Roman legions were perfect for the wars they were designed to fight. Parthian cavalry were perfect for the terrain they chose to defend. When perfection met perfection on the wrong battlefield, 20,000 men paid for their general's arrogance. Contemporary accounts force us to confront the human scale. Publius Crassus, Caesar's trusted cavalry commander, ordering his own death rather than face capture. Octavius refusing escape to attempt rescuing his commander. 4,000 wounded men listening to their comrades' footsteps fade in the darkness, knowing they'd been abandoned. Gaius Cassius watching Roman discipline collapse, then spending years proving one officer could learn from catastrophe. Each of the 20,000 dead was someone's son. Many were fathers. The 10,000 prisoners who marched to Alexandria Margiana left families who would never know their fate. This is what failure looks like when you count in human lives rather than tactical abstractions. Marcus Licinius Crassus spent his life accumulating wealth and chasing glory. He got his Eastern command. He got his battle. His head became a prop in a Greek tragedy, while his enemy's king watched and applauded. There's poetry in that ending. The kind of poetry that makes you wonder whether Euripides or Plutarch or the gods themselves wrote this script. The boundary Crassus couldn't cross became Rome's boundary for half a millennium. The eagles he lost took 33 years and diplomatic humiliation to recover. The son he killed with his ambition never got his own epitaph beyond a few lines in Plutarch's cautionary tale. The First Triumvirate died with him, triggering civil wars that would end the Republic and birth the Empire. A desert battlefield 2,000 miles from Rome changed the course of Western civilization. 8 centuries later, Byzantine generals posting to the eastern frontier studied Carrhae's lessons. They understood what Crassus learned too late: that geography limits ambition, that technology alone doesn't win wars, that the enemy gets a vote in how battles are fought. They read Plutarch's account and made different choices. Some succeeded, some failed. But they all knew the story of the richest man in Rome who died in a marsh without a denarius to his name. Somewhere in the Mesopotamian desert, the exact battlefield has been lost to time. Modern Harran sits near where ancient Carrhae stood, but archaeologists have never definitively located the killing ground where 7 legions bled out under the June sun. Perhaps that's fitting. The physical location matters less than the lessons it taught. Those remain, documented in ancient sources and proven again by every general who forgot them. The Euphrates still flows between Turkey and Syria, still marking boundaries between nations and cultures. The plains near modern Haran still stretch flat and endless, perfect terrain for cavalry, nightmare ground for heavy infantry. And in the pages of Plutarch's life of Crassus, 40,000 Romans still march toward their appointment with impossibility, a battle where all the advantages meant nothing, and perfect tactics defeated perfect soldiers.